We are back with another season, ready to rock and roll. Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast.
Is that by popular demand, Jonathan?
Absolutely. The people are clamoring for more. They can't get enough of us.
The wonderful thing about season 2 is that you found a job, and it's quite a prestigious job. It's a lecturer in sociology at Wits University. Tell us why you have chosen a life of poverty.
I have found a job, Johan. I'm absolutely delighted. I'm just 2 months at Wits and having an absolutely great time. I'm telling you, the monkish life has always been the life for me. Now I get to sit surrounded by books and also surrounded by students telling me all the reasons they couldn't submit their essays.
And of course, you could read ChatGPT generated essays. That's wonderful.
Oh, it's going to be a great time. ChatGPT is going to have so much to tell me. It's going to be fantastic.
We are back with season 2. We started season 1 in August last year. It ran all the way, I think, until April and May. And now we're back for another season. What are you most excited about for season 2?
Yeah, I mean, we had such a great season 1, and I think that it was just so many kind of interesting, insightful, exciting perspectives that really broadened my mind. And I think that that's exactly what I'm looking forward to in season 2, pushing my thinking further and forward and getting to engage with the top people in the world who are thinking about Africa and thinking about where we come from and where we're going. So I'm super excited about that. What about you? What are you looking forward to?
Well, at first I should probably say that there's clear causal evidence now that starting a podcast gets you an academic job.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for all those very eager young scholars out there, this is clearly the way to go. I'm very excited as well. I think the first season was a massive success. Of course, it's much harder work than we imagined, and we have to read a lot more. But it forces you to read, and it often forces you to read outside of your disciplinary boundaries, which I also enjoyed. That is probably the most beneficial aspect of the podcast for me, is that I tend to know the economic history literature quite well, and of course something that I think we need to do more of at universities. We are very much stuck in our academic silos. So that was really great, and hopefully the listeners will also benefit from this kind of interdisciplinary experience.
Absolutely. So to you, the listeners, we're excited to have you on for the ride with us as we meander through the world of what top experts have to say about Africa and where we come from and where we're going.
Welcome to season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us.
We're fortunate to have with us today an economic historian who has walked the path of African economic history from its very beginnings. Anthony Hopkins is a British historian renowned for his groundbreaking research on Africa's economic past, European colonialism and globalization. He is Emeritus Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at the University of Cambridge, an Emeritus Fellow of Pembroke College, and a Fellow of the British Academy.
Widely celebrated for his contributions to understanding Africa's past within a global context, including his pioneering work in the 1970s and economic history of West Africa, all the way through to his recent works, Africa, Empire and World Disorder, as well as Capitalism in the Colonies in 2024. Hopkins continues to shape how we think about economic change and historical development.
Tony, it's wonderful to have you as our first guest of season 2. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Let me then start with a very contemporary issue, and that is globalization at the moment. Part of your research focus has been over many years the history of globalization. And of course, we're at a time where globalization is under threat. Trump's trade war with China, but also the broader world. I mean, South Africa certainly has suffered some of the consequences with 30% tariffs raised very recently. Your Prime Minister recently said that globalization was dead, that the world as we know it is gone. How would a historian of globalization respond to that comment?
Well, I didn't know that Keir Starmer had said that, actually, but of course, it's a sentiment that we hear quite freely these days. And this is not a lead up to dismissing the possibility, but it is my own introduction to saying that these comments are made understandably of the moment with a rather limited context historically around them. And within that framework, they make a lot of sense. The same thing was said in the 1930s, of course. So what historians have to do is to try to place the presentism, the comments of today, in a context that is necessarily larger than that. I leave the future aside for a moment. But if we look at what, without defining globalization, we all roughly know what we mean by it. Of course, we did have a phase from the 1830s to the late 1990s, where there was a very fair degree of free trade, not coincidentally associated with the rise of Britain as a great power. And then, of course, we had this big so-called deglobalization in the interwar period, at which the last set of gloomy remarks were made. But then, of course, you come to the great disaster of World War II, out of which has come the greatest long boom the world has ever known. It's amazing to think about it, because we often consider, when we talk of the expansion of the economic boom after World War II, we think of Asia in particular, South Asia, East Asia. We have a question mark over Africa, which I won't go into for the moment. But even more stunning was the development in Europe of countries like Switzerland and the Nordic countries, which really were very agricultural and pretty primitive, forgive the word, down to 1945, and have evolved so that today we look on them really as the epitome of development, not only economic but social development. So it doesn't mean that alternative law or that what we have now is going to stay. So coming to the point, we're clearly in a situation which you adequately describe, and we have this particular influence of Trump and his tariffs. I'll make 2 points on this. First of all, irrespective of present policy, we should also think of the degree of integration which has taken place and has continued to take place even during the era of deglobalization in the 1930s. We think of the contraction of the tariff wars. This was also a time of the development of airplanes. So the degree of integration that we have is not going to be easily unraveled. And if we look on the bright side, in the 1930s, as I said, the rapid development of airplanes, knitting the world together for the first time, is something that looks to the future, even at a time of despondency and contraction in other ways. That degree of integration has grown, and Trump's tariffs face a problem that the supply chains are so complex and worldwide that he's going to sever links or try to do so. And the goal would seem to be to recreate a kind of national self-sufficiency. Now, it's true that the United States is the only developed country which is big enough to have a go at this. But we should remember that the United States lost its self-sufficiency around the 1980s, and from that time onward has been increasingly involved with the rest of the world. You know the examples, I won't go into them. So I would conclude, briefly and inconclusively, by saying that we have got these rich examples of extensive integration. Trump has these policies which will, in a way, turn the clock back if they succeed. You don't know. And these policies have been watered and postponed and so on. And I notice on several fronts the glad morning of his election, when he was going to stop wars in 2 days and do other things, the sense of reality is beginning to percolate. And I'm not saying that the tariff policies are going to be scrapped, but I suspect that they will be watered down.
You have spoken in general about waves of globalization as this process of expansion and then emergence of countervailing forces, a kind of dialectic process, and how that have shaped waves of decolonization in response to the kind of expansion of central powers in the past. Do you think that that same framework applies here? Is this a moment of countervailing forces that are pushing back against a global expansion, or is there something else going on? It seems to be coming more from the center than from the peripheries.
Well, I'm not allowed to say this, but I will. I don't know. You must remember, I answer your question with the following assumption in my mind. Historians are poorly paid to understand the past. Some other social scientists are highly paid to misunderstand the future. There's a problem of prediction. I don't know. I can only point out that countervailing forces have, in at least one instance, manifested themselves at the time. I mean, Schumpeter would have liked to see that happen in a degree it did. Whether that is happening now, we'd have to look to AI, we'd have to look at various elements in the service industries to be confident that's going to happen. I would be surprised, this is just instinct, I would be surprised if we do finish up with a self-sufficient economy. Even if the United States finishes up with a self-sufficient economy, I would be very surprised.
Tony, on the idea of historical comparisons, I mean, in a 2018 article in History Today, I think it's actually also a quote in your book. You said that history is rediscovered when international order is deranged. And then I'm going to quote from this article, as novel events strain the explanatory power of customary approaches, commentators whose interest lies in contemporary affairs turn to the past to trace the roots of present discontents. So it seems to me, as someone who's read a little bit about applied history, that you're making the case for some kind of applied history, that we want to do history not only to understand the past, but also to understand the present and perhaps see if the past is analogous to the present, whether we can learn lessons from the past. Do you think that that is one purpose of history? Is that something that historians should take on board?
Yes, of course. In my case, I mean, if you are studying the medieval world or the Black Death, I won't take the Black Death because that could link up with pandemics today, but you can clearly think of some legitimate historical topics which do not have an immediate, quote-unquote, relevance to the present. To keep it simple, my own work and attitude is fully in accord with yours. I wonder if I could give myself a plug. This is such a rare event that you must allow it. You may not know this, or perhaps I've told you 20 times, but my very last book is now in press, and it's called The Land Where Nothing Works, How Britain Lost the Plot. The argument of the book is to understand what I take to be, and most other people agree, the absolutely dire state of Britain today, and especially gross inequalities, regional and social. Now, I have tried to explain this by looking, roughly speaking, at the beginning, after 1945, the social democratic experiment, and more convincingly that the Gini coefficient of equality and inequality was narrower during that period. And many other indications of welfare come out very well during that period. I'm glossing lots of contrary facts over, but that's the trend. And then in 1979, as we all know, Margaret Thatcher came to power. Britain adopted not only American foreign policy, which we'd already adopted, but American domestic policy, and have done ever since. And that has led us into a situation where we are today. Now, my analysis, I mean, I try to explain this, it's all linked up with the shift to the financialization of the economy, which I don't condemn, I observe it as something that's in fact. One of the things it's done in present-day Britain is to make it more remunerative to become a rentier than to invest it productively. It's a bit formulaic. Britain is in a special position of having very tight restrictions on land, and therefore investing in houses, it's a one-way bet because the price will only go up. And this is linked to the limited availability of capital. Manufacturing comes as secondary disconnected or unconnected market. And it's also linked with social regional inequalities, which are not just economic. You can see patterns of suicide you can trace longevity. If you live in the northeast, average age of death is 73. In the south, where I live, it's 83. So there are these great differences which became elongated or they widened during this period. Now, okay, if that is true, what ought we to do? Now, what I've done, I wrote a very careful paragraph on this in which I try to get the credit to myself, while at the same time saying I'm really handing this over to commentators who are better qualified, and I mean that. But basically, it's a very simple policy analysis. If I'm right, then what we need to do is to stop following the American model, to bring forward elements of the social democratic model, and borrow from our neighbours, not all of them, and selectively, to get an economy which, in the words of the Labour Manifesto of 1945, aimed to creating fair shares.
Certainly. I mean, I want to expand on this idea of capitalism then. And you've written about capitalism in many different contexts, in the US, in your book on British imperialism, but also in your book on capitalism in the colonies very recently. So what can Europe, and perhaps even the US, learn from the African experience? We often ask what African countries should learn or have not learned perhaps from the European or the Western experience. But as a scholar who's traversed these different contexts, are there lessons that Britain perhaps today or Europe can learn from what happened in Africa and perhaps avoid those lessons or implement the lessons, those that did work?
Well, I prefer to keep this, because I don't think that Vasti was gaze to the positive things. Of course, there were many negatives which have already been taken care of, so to speak, by the trampling of colonialism and then the actions opposed to independent governments. But I can only speak very generally, and forgive me for this. I mean, I do think there remain very strongly elements in most African societies of what I will crudely call a community spirit, which we have in many ways tried to destroy. I remember the early efforts of development economists, forgive me, will have in the 1960s to destroy the extended family by redesigning the houses and so on. A kind of fervor was born of the belief that you had to have a man, a woman, and 2.1 children, or forget the 2.1 children out of Russia, that's already gone. And there was that kind of crudity, which even to me, a young historian, struck me as being anachronistic, ahistorical, Syrian. But in one sense, my concern with how we enjoy modern technology without destroying a sense of community. And that goes down to what economics or certain types of economics say about welfare. And forgive me and you can correct me, but roughly speaking, what I can summarize as an American economics is well aware of inequalities, but it's not an issue. Basically, growth will trickle down. So, well, inequality, lack of opportunities in the United States are greater than in any other part of the developed world. And they have gone further to breaking down, deliberately or not, any concept of community. This comes back to my feeling that the way we should go is to rediscover some of our own roots, which are neglected. Most people thinking about how Easter can't start with Thatcher. They don't know about this social democracy experiment. And we should also borrow from parts of Europe that suit us. That's Europe. I give you one example, which I think an African would sympathize with. In many towns in Europe, since the 1990s, they've adopted something called 15-minute cities. You may or may not know about this. Very quick to me. The concept is that every community within an urban radius should have access to a small group of shops, making a cafe, but certainly shops for essentials, within 15 minutes of walking or cycling. And what this has done is to revitalize different bits of the city, which previously were just dormitories, and now have sprung up with not entirely self-sufficient with the local communities. It's just one example of many things. We don't do that in Britain, of course, because that's what foreigners do. And we go west instead of east.
I wanted to jump in and ask, you have been working on African economic history. You were writing some of these pioneering works in the 60s, and you've seen African history go through so many seismic shifts. You've also worked with imperial history and seen imperial history go through these seismic shifts. And, this makes me think from a period of decolonization, the writing of non-Western histories, nationalist histories, the challenge to nationalist histories, and these new forms of global histories and imperial histories. So kind of across all of that, I wanted to ask you two questions. The one is, in your own journey and your own development, what were some of the most powerful, interesting intellectual concepts for you? Some things that kind of shifted your perspective along the journey as you've been thinking over the years? Any moments where the scales fell off your eyes and you thought, oh, that's just something really powerful and new?
I'm afraid I've still got lots of scales, but that's an excellent question. Let me see if I get my mind around that. Why did I begin to work on Africa when, putting it frankly and not in my favor at all, there was nothing, professionally speaking. Even the School of African Studies didn't have a course on African history. My supervisor was the first professor of African history, Johan Fourie at Smuts. And when I graduated, in those days there were no MAs, no MPhils. You graduated, you started a PhD 3 months later. And I spent 3 months. I nearly worked on Latin America, but then I realized the Americans had colonized that. I wanted to work on the Japanese silk industry, but that would take 6 years of Japanese, another 5 or so for Mandarin. I'd be middle-aged before I started anything. And I thought, am I good enough to produce a work of genius at that point? No. And so I came to Africa not as a second, third, fourth best, but because John Fage, I was given an introduction to him. And he records it in his memoir. And I came in and he said, oh, I understand you want to write the economic history of Africa. Right? I said, no, I'd like to make a start on a bit of it. And he said, well, I don't know anything about it, but I think it's a great idea. If that's all I feel, I'll supervise you. Now, the explanation behind my interest was that I had studied European and British history in the crucial 16th, 17th century period, which at that time was the center of debate about religion and the rise of capitalism and transition from agricultural industry and so on. And I knew all of this stuff backwards, and I was going to work on the merchants of Stuart London. And then it occurred to me that if I did all this, what's the guarantee that I could do anything with the same brain power, distinctive? And the answer wasn't a guarantee at all. And I thought to myself, I don't want to spend my life at public expense doing something that is dotting the I and crossing the T. So I took my abiding interest in the rise of capitalism and I applied it to Africa, really. And that's when I had, for the first time, and very crudely, I would say, to try to judge the merits of introducing notions of the Western market while giving as much room as knowledge permitted to indigenous constraints on development into colonial Africa. And some of that still stood up, by the way, the land-labor ratio question. And of course, it all looks grossly inadequate now. But I tried to put those two things together in a way that would at least get other people to do different work. That was the first and most important of my decisions. And to give you one more, this is going to count against me, most unfortunate. By the time my Economic History of West Africa was published, march on about 10 years, and the field had expanded. We've got foundations, programs of African studies, and all these young, eager beavers were much smarter than me, better trained, and so on. And I thought to myself, and I was under pressure to deal with this criticism and that and so on and so on. And I thought, no, I've made my statement. That's the best I can do at the moment. And everyone else cut it up. And this is a point that relates to what you're saying. To some extent, history goes in waves, as every subject goes in fashions, however you wish to describe it. At that moment, from 1960 through to a point around 1980s, imperial history was done. In 1960, if you had just completed a PhD on British policy towards X, forget it, you'd be cleaning the streets or something. So what I decided to do, this was an intellectual reaction, so to speak, from the story I've told you so far. I elbowed my way into a course on British Empire I hadn't done before with a wonderful friend, Peter Kane, and we talked together and we tried a few things. The point was, it was exactly when the studies of imperial history had gone out of favour that we thought there was sufficient new work, particularly on the rise of service industries in Britain, to be able to do something which was a bit more than the usual ding-dong between Marxists and liberals. And so we devised this notion of gentlemanly capitalism in order to capture and emphasise a development that is now in all the books, by the way. Cambridge Economic History of Europe, or England, whatever it's called, has a chapter on this now. And I'm not saying we did that, but this subject is now considered in a much more extensive way than previously. So that was a perception about the development of the subject. I might say that some of our early papers in the early 1980s at conferences were received very badly because we thought, we're renegades, you started African history, look what you know, turning the clock back. So that was a second example. As you can see, I could talk for another hour or so, but I won't.
Tony, to just explain to the uninformed listener, what do you mean when you say gentlemanly capitalism? What is it that the listener should take away?
Well, capitalists in this context were money makers who were capitalists, but they also did something to create a capitalist system. The gentlemanly element attempted to add a social dimension to this story, partly to make sure we weren't accused of what used to be called economism. We've got a very simple-minded view of development. The gentleman element came in as an attempt to solve the problem. How did feudalism give way to industrialization? We didn't see it that way. To us, what was called feudalism were large landholders in the 18th century that got absorbed into this new financial service industry as it developed from the early 18th century. And so capitalism in that shape was not a product of the new social force, although some of them were imported from the war, but it represented an adaptation from a previous history. I had the idea of the adaptation of traditional elites through looking at anthropological and other work on what was then called the Third World. And we began to learn about this degree of adaptability, which previously had just been put in a box as traditional society. So that helped me. It gave me a bit of confidence in thinking about applying this idea to Britain.
Oh, that's great. So you also have this wonderful piece where you review 50 years of African economic history. And it's a delightful piece, and it's full of wonderful kind of wry reflections on these kind of grand theoretical schools and the somewhat cultish followers at various stages of these things. For the listener there, you lay out, modernization, dependency, Marxism, postmodernism, kind of roughly, and these kind of different waves. And then you look at this most recent wave of new economic history, new African economic history, a kind of approach. But one thing I wanted to ask is, having seen these different schools, these different central ideas, and having watched them develop in relation to each other, of course, the kind of wave moves on and the cutting edge of what we're talking about and what we're thinking about keeps going forward. Are there some kind of key insights or big ideas or questions that we've moved past that you think we could kind of productively reach back to in order to spur us further still? Is there anything that you would point to as big key things to reach to?
That's another, as they say in the States, great question, i.e. that people can't answer. First of all, let me say I am a humble admirer of new economic history, especially in the hands of the new wave like Johan and Emeritus and so on. And that's given nothing but increased knowledge and fresh interpretations. Now, I won't say where that's going. No, there's a famous little story given in Peter Walsh's book called The Philosophy of History, something like that. And he quotes this little comment, and it was, Humphrey Lyttelton is a famous jazz trumpeter. Humphrey Lyttelton was once asked which way jazz was going. And he answered, man, if I knew which way jazz was going, I'd be there already. So I'm not going to guess what's going to happen to new economic history. I can be pulled out on that one. But going back to things, none of these is revelatory for this audience. The first one is the neglect of pre-colonial history. So new economic history, and it's not responsible for that, but new economic history has attracted tremendous number, not tremendous, gifted number of young students who work in that. And that really basically colonial art history. And what the irony is that what's missing now is what we began to go on try to do in the 1960s and was for a time of the real apex of the subject. And I remember talking to John Lemon about this a couple of years ago, and he's one of the great historians of pre-colonial Africa. And he was depressed. He said, there's no one here to replace us. And I said, well, why is that? And thought, oh, well, people want relevance. But he said, the other thing is, it's just such damned hard work. You've got to learn languages, you've got to do field work, you've got to study difficult, ambiguous texts. So I think the big weakness and gap now is that indigenous history has been left behind. The second point is perhaps a little more contentious. I'm sticking a pin into Johan now. I'm not really because he's an exception, but going to conferences where young new economic historians speak, I'm really conscious that most of them have very limited historical and historiographical sense of why they're doing what they are. They're often doing things that are actually colonial history, which is wonderful. If they very rarely place it in that context, they often don't pause to think, well, are we writing a new kind of colonial history? If so, how are we changing that existing literature? It's as if they start relatively recently from a starting point given by the new economic history and then go from there. And much of the commentaries is self-referencing. And I think that is a limitation on new economic history within its own orbit, so to speak. Quite apart from the fact that it may be drawing students from some of them more neglected and very difficult subject. Well, I think I've spoiled the interview with that remark.
Fortunately, you can say whatever you want. And
I'll never be invited to South Africa again. No, it's okay.
Tony, I was actually expecting you to say something else or make a third point, but I thought you would say something about the role of entrepreneurship in Africa. And part of the reason, I guess, that entrepreneurship today is less studied, maybe it's a wider movement, not only in African economic history, but also in global economic history, is that entrepreneurship is, of course, very difficult to quantify. So I was wondering, you've done a lot of work on entrepreneurship. What is it that we miss by not looking at the role of entrepreneurs? I'm referring specifically here to your work on kind of late 19th century Nigerian entrepreneurs, and it's fascinating work. And you've just referred to this thing that I found especially fascinating, is that you place them in their context, right? That you show us how they move from a system of liberation and post-slavery. There's this era, it seems, of optimism, of a Britishness in some sense where they feel that they can partake in the system to one where they start feeling that they are controlled by the system and ultimately move back to their Nigerian root, if I can put it that way. So what do we lose by not looking at entrepreneurs, and how do we shift the focus back to them?
Yes. Well, that's another great question. And I can say that I deliberately omitted entrepreneurs from my previous comment because it's fractionally more specialized than the general comment I offered, but it does come as one among several illustrations of that general point. Well, I mean, there are many justifications, and I won't labor them all as to why entrepreneurs are important. And minimally, they are people who really do begin to change the economy. And for that very simple reason, we do need them. And it's interesting to try to understand the circumstance in which they rise, flourish, and decline. Now, of course, we should acknowledge that actually one of the earliest developments in African economic history was study of long-distance trade because it was accessible. Agriculture was much more difficult, but trade was easily studied before the slave trade. And then in the heyday of the first heyday of African economic history, when all the people in the 70s were moving in, a number of scholars did write studies of individual African merchants. I won't call them all entrepreneurs, but anyway, merchants. And then as economic history of Africa dived in the mid-80s onwards, until the revival that we all know about, entrepreneurs faded. When I came to my Bible, I thought that the subject would probably have been, worked out. To my amazement, it was still there. And it is that sense that there's a huge gap that is really worth filling in that gave me the courage to update and expand my research about that book. Another thing was I got 160 entrepreneurs, most are merchants, but some do other things, as I should explain. That is the largest sample that I know of indigenous entrepreneurs in African history. One of the things I'm half trying to do now is to see if I can collect some younger scholars together who might welcome having an outlet to get a volume of a special issue or even independent volume together in order to underline the significance of the subject and give an opening, a theatre, so to speak, for young scholars. I'm not making a lot of progress yet. I've had a lot of positive noises from Jeff Jones and others. But when it comes to the practicalities of finding names, it's difficult. So I'm going to persist with this for a little bit and see if it is possible.
You mentioned young scholars frequently in your answers. And I quite vividly remember when you visited Stellenbosch a couple of years ago, you gave me this great metaphor of how to think about a PhD when you're a young scholar. You said that you can either be a brick in the wall or you can design the architecture. I found that incredibly powerful and profound, but I was hoping you could explain what you meant to the listeners. What is it when you're a young scholar? How do you differentiate between being a brick in the wall and designing the architecture?
Yes, I mean, it's a parallel process, isn't it? We all write detailed articles, or most of us do, and that's partly gaining experience, and it's partly the essential part, and history is made of bricks, so to speak. We've got to make the bricks first. But as I tried to explain, when I first started, I was motivated by a desire to follow the Western concepts of the evolution of capitalism to somewhere else. So that was my immediate impulse. It wasn't because I felt that I'd got a unique capacity to do this. It was rather, as I too openly explained, I didn't see how I could contribute anything other than ticking the I, crossing the T to the established subjects in the European history at the time. And there were giants then who made their reputation. And as giants do, they sold all sorts of a family of clones who they would direct. You do merchants here, and so on. And I didn't want to be part of that. I wasn't going to spend my time and public money just doing that. So it was a kind of sense of inadequacy as well as ambition that drove me. Similarly, with gentlemanly capitalism, I've had my very close friend, a wonderful intellectual historian, Peter Kane, we set out to try to find a way through the antonyms of Marxism, whatever you were thinking. An American empire actually applies some of my ideas about globalization. There's been a nice set of essays in that book, which to my delight rather approve of my interpretation of the 19th century, mainly borrowing from colonial history and neo-colonialism, very good use the term. The United States was formally independent in 1783, but didn't actually achieve effective independence right through to the late 19th century at exactly the same time as the European states did. And so this kind of exceptionalism I criticized to my pleasure and surprise, that has found a lot of favor.
Maybe I can just jump in on a question on that American Empire book, because I think that there is a kind of wonderful move you make here, which is to say, yeah, let's see America in this kind of orbit of Western imperialism, interconnected with these Western imperialism as a kind of mini imperialist itself. But I wanted to ask a question about, so this comes back to, in some ways, this reluctance to say anything about the future. And in that book, you have this wonderful little bit where you say, Dante promises that the eighth circle of hell is for the fraudulent, the diviners and the prophets. But I wanted to maybe condemn you to the eighth circle of hell and ask you, is there anything that we can learn about kind of America's aspiration at being a global hegemon? Is there something that we can learn about the kind of period where Britain was the global hegemon? Is America's hegemony kind of weakening? And is there anything that we might take from Britain's moment of weakening hegemony that we might imagine the present and the future for where to for America?
Yes. I mean, I can guess this one as badly as anyone else. It seems to me that you could interpret both the rise of Johnson and of Trump, at least minimally being a manifestation of an acute disquiet and distress within the two states. Then we have to fit in the question we began with. I think the trend has been away from the United States, broadly speaking, since World War II, but increasingly so in the last 30 years. The rise of China is one obvious example. And the rise of Europe, like the European community with all its faults, and the very development of other countries, India not being too far behind, does make it, I think, very difficult for the United States, to say, during the time of the Cold War. And so I think if I had to kind of lay a bet on this, it wouldn't be a lot of money. But I think that the world is moving towards a more multipolar arrangement, which is not fully formulated yet, and that the United States will eventually have to adjust to this. And the pain of doing so has not really been felt yet. It's extraordinarily difficult. It's one thing to say objectively, look, we really should try to behave like a middle rank in power, but actually people in power from left or right just can't bring themselves to do that. And so it's a very hard road adjusting to reality. We can say that in the case of Britain, but clearly with slipping down by any measure, the United States is not like that. But my guess would be that we're in the early stages of seeing how in international relations is a matter of relativity shifting away from the states.
Tony, we have a tradition on the Our Long Walk podcast, and that is to end the podcast with a question from ChatGPT. So I've asked ChatGPT to ask the brilliant Anthony Hopkins a question, because we're on this theme of, present policy, and we obviously started the podcast also with that applied history question. So let me ask you, suppose economic historians became policymakers for a day, tasked with advising African governments. Given all you've learned about missteps in economic history, what would be the first and perhaps unorthodox recommendation to ensure African prosperity?
I need a lot of money to answer that question. I'm not ruining my reputation for nothing. ChatGPT has asked the questions which is not matched by answers to them. There's so much circularity in the dilemma of African states, mass poverty and mass unemployment, wealthy elites controlling power, corruption, and so on and so on. You could begin at any part of that cycle and try to break it. And I don't know, I think is the anticlimax to your question. Those are the top issues that how and where you start. It's something else, because if you assume the start of belief has to come from within, and then observers like me first can pontificate without having any food.
Tony, one of the traditions we have here is we create music about your research. And here is the song, so let's have a listen.
There once was a scholar named Tony, whose theories on markets weren't phony. Though he claims it was luck, his ideas have stuck. Half a century's proof they're not stony. Hopkins showed how imperial ties bred gentlemanly capitalism, he said. Britain's empire was tied to finance and pride, a concept that historians still spread. He watched as the field came alive, quant methods began to revive. Grand theories grew tight, now precise and just right, and African research did thrive. Hopkins urged disciplines unite, economics and history's inside. Learn methods each side, let theory and source guide, then your work can reach brilliant height. Said Hopkins to scholars anew, think big, not just footnotes to view. Start with puzzles to chase and historiography's place. Original work then shines through.
Okay, then it's just a repeat of the previous.
That was fantastic. I think I can die happy now. This is my 50 minutes of fame. I made it finally. Wonderful stuff.
Thank you, Tony, for a wonderful conversation. Anthony Hopkins, Professor of Economic History at Cambridge University. Thank you for listening and tuning in to the first podcast of the second season. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with the next episode. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Vasti Calitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andri Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.